The envelope had no return address. Reuben Voss turned it over twice in the grease-dark light of his garage in Flagstaff, Arizona, the single bulb above his workbench swinging in the November draft that slipped under the door. The paper was yellowed at the corners. His name was written on the front in a hand he recognized immediately, the same blocky, forward-leaning print he hadn't seen in 11 years. He set the envelope on the workbench beside a rusted socket set and a half-eaten sleeve of crackers and did not open it. He just stood there. And the 1968 Triumph Bonneville T120 he'd been rebuilding for 3 years sat beside him on its kickstand, patient as a mule, chrome tank reflecting his shape back at him, smaller than he remembered himself being. He did not open that envelope for 6 days. And when he finally did, what fell out changed the shape of everything. There was a photograph first. 2 men on motorcycles, squinting into a high desert sun, arms around each other's shoulders. One of them was Reuben, maybe 30 years old, his hair longer, his jaw unclenched. The other was a man named Cord Pruett, tall, raw-boned, with the kind of smile that arrived slow and stayed long. Behind them, a hand-painted sign for Route 89 in Page, Arizona. Below the photograph, a single folded note in that same blocky hand. Reuben unfolded it slowly. It read, "The chapter voted you out." "I didn't. I never did. Come to Harlan, Kentucky. I need you to hear the truth before I can't say it anymore. There's not much time left. Cord." Reuben read it 3 more times. Then he folded it back along its original creases and placed it inside the breast pocket of his flannel shirt, right against his sternum. He put on his jacket. He walked back to the workbench and looked at the Bonneville, its freshly lapped valves, its rebuilt Amol carburetors, the polished primary chain case that had cost him 2 months of weekend work. He pressed his palm flat against the tank. The metal was cold in the way that only old steel gets cold, holding the temperature like memory holds the past. Dense and still and waiting. He had not ridden her yet. 3 years of work and he hadn't thrown a leg over her once. He figured Harlan, Kentucky was as good a reason as any to start. Reuben Voss was 56 years old that November. He'd been a member of the Iron Meridian Motorcycle Club for 17 years, a chapter based out of Flagstaff, one of 9 chapters scattered from New Mexico to Montana, all of them connected by a common code and the kind of trust that gets welded together by shared road and shared trouble. He'd prospected for 14 months, which was longer than most men lasted. He'd served 2 tours in Vietnam before joining Army Infantry, 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry, and he'd come home from that war with a head full of things he couldn't describe at a dinner table and a body that ached in weather. The Iron Meridian had given him a structure for what he couldn't give words to. Brothers who understood without asking. A road that absorbed what no bedroom ceiling could. For 17 years, that was enough. Then came the accusation. A man named Dillard Hennessy, a new member, prospecting barely 4 months, had stood up at a chapter meeting in the winter of 2003 and told the room that Reuben Voss had ratted to the Coconino County Sheriff's Department about a weapons cache in a storage unit off Route 180. He said he had proof. He held up a photocopy of something, a statement, he called it, with Reuben's name on it. He spoke with the particular conviction of a man who believes his own lies or has been paid well to repeat someone else's. Reuben stood up and said he hadn't done it. Said it once, plainly, the way a man who is telling the truth doesn't feel the need to say it twice. But the room had already shifted. He could feel it the way you feel a temperature change underground, subtle, bone-deep, irreversible. 2 members wouldn't meet his eyes. The chapter president, a man named Walt Tibbetts, said they needed time to investigate. And in the Iron Meridian, time to investigate meant you turned in your colors and went home and waited by the phone. Reuben drove home that night on his old '74 Honda CB 550, parked it in the garage, went inside, and waited. The phone never rang. 3 weeks later, a sealed envelope arrived. No return address, even then, no return address. Inside, his patch, folded neatly. No letter. No explanation. No due process, no hearing, no right of reply. Just the patch. He'd held it for a long time that night, standing in the same garage where he now stood, and then he'd set it on the workbench and walked inside and eaten a bowl of cold cereal and gone to sleep and woken up and gone to work at the machine shop on North Beaver Street, same as always. He didn't call anyone. He didn't ride. He let 11 years go by the way a man lets a scar go by, watching it fade, watching it remain. He bought the 1968 Triumph Bonneville T120 from an estate sale in Sedona 2 years after he was voted out. The bike had been sitting in a barn for 2 decades, mice in the airbox, rust on the brake drums, the original red and silver tank paint mostly intact under the grime. He'd loaded it into the bed of his F-150 and brought it home and started disassembling it that same evening, not because he was in a hurry but because his hands needed something to hold. 3 years of slow, meticulous resurrection. He rebuilt the engine from scratch, new pistons and rings, reground crank, fresh rod bearings. He cleaned the gearbox with the patience of a man who has nowhere else to be. He relined the drum brakes. He rewired the whole electrical system with period-correct cloth-wrapped wire, every connection soldered by hand. The headlight bucket was chrome-buffed by a retired machinist in Williams who charged him $40 and took 3 weeks and did a perfect job. The bike was ready. Reuben was the part that hadn't been. He packed on the evening of the 6th day after Cord's letter arrived, a bedroll strapped with bungee cords to the rear fender rack, a canvas tool bag tied behind it, extra spark plugs, a tire patch kit, a changes of clothes, a bottle of aspirin, and a thermos that leaked slightly from its lid but that he kept because it had been his wife Margaret's before she passed in 2008. He checked the oil level. He checked the tire pressure. He topped off the tank at the Texaco on Milton Road, $12 of premium, the station attendant glancing at the Triumph the way people glance at something beautiful and old. Reuben pulled on his gloves. He stood beside the bike at the pump and looked east. 1,956 miles lay between his Flagstaff garage and Harlan, Kentucky. He'd checked. He kicked the Triumph to life on the second attempt, the engine caught with that distinctive parallel twin bark, a mechanical voice unlike anything made since, half combustion and half conversation. It settled into a lumpy idle that smoothed as the oil warmed, and Reuben sat on the seat and felt the vibration come up through his legs and into his spine, and somewhere behind his ribs something loosened that he hadn't known was clenched. He rolled out of the Texaco onto Milton Road and then southeast toward I-40, and the November air hit his face at 40 miles an hour with the clean, cold authority of a fact he couldn't argue with. He was riding. He was finally riding. The road took him east out of Flagstaff on Interstate 40, the San Francisco peaks fading in his mirrors, the high desert spreading out in all directions like a table set for something enormous. The Triumph cruised at a steady 60 miles per hour, any faster and the old parallel twin started buzzing, his hands numb through the bars. He didn't mind. He had nothing to race toward and nothing to run from. He had a letter in his breast pocket and 1,956 miles to figure out what he was going to do when he arrived. He stopped for gas in Winslow, Arizona, just off the highway where the old Posada Hotel stood. He'd passed through Winslow 100 times in his life and never once stopped here, and now he stood with a gas nozzle in his hand looking at the hotel's old painted facade and felt the specific weight of all the times he'd ridden past things without stopping. He bought a coffee from a vending machine outside a convenience store. It was bad coffee, thin and overheated, and he drank all of it standing beside the Triumph, watching a pair of ravens argue over something in the parking lot. The wind had picked up from the northwest. He could feel it trying to push him sideways every time he passed an overpass or a gap in the scrub. He leaned into it without thinking, the body remembering what the mind had filed away. He crossed into New Mexico at mile 137, the welcome sign appearing like a punchline to a long joke. He filled up again in gallop at a Flying J, stretched his back beside the pump, and counted the miles in his head. He'd need to camp somewhere before Albuquerque if the cold kept dropping. He'd brought a sleeping bag rated to 20 degrees, optimistic given the time of year but all he owned. Outside Albuquerque he pulled off onto Route 66 for a stretch, the old road, the one that preceded the interstate, the one that remembered what highways used to be. He rode it through Albuquerque's older neighborhoods, past tire shops and Mexican restaurants with hand-painted signs, past a laundromat with its lights on at 9 in the evening, past a church with a marquee that read, "All are welcome, especially the weary." He read it twice, the second time looking back over his shoulder, and then he kept going. He made camp that night in a KOA outside Santa Rosa, New Mexico. The temperature fell to 28 degrees by midnight. He lay in his sleeping bag on a foam pad he'd bought at a Walmart in Albuquerque, his jacket thrown over the top of the bag, and stared at the tent ceiling and listened to the Triumph ticking as it cooled and thought about Cord Pruett. He'd met Cord in 1989 at a swap meet in Prescott Valley. Cord was from Kentucky originally, Harlan County, mining country, where his father and grandfather had both gone into the earth every day of their working lives and come out gray and coughing. Cord had left at 18, worked construction in Phoenix for a decade, then drifted to Flagstaff when the Phoenix heat stopped agreeing with him. He was 3 years younger than Reuben, with enormous hands that could fix almost anything mechanical and a gentleness that surprised people who saw him first from a distance. He'd ridden a 1979 Harley-Davidson Shovelhead FLH when they met, Lucifer's Chopper, he called it, because it ran perfect for 364 days and then destroyed something essential on the one day you most needed it. It had a leaking rocker box, a front brake that felt optimistic at best, and Cord loved it with complete uncritical devotion. They became friends the way you become friends with someone when you both spent time in the same war, carrying the same silences. Cord had done 2 tours in Vietnam as well, Marine Corps, 3rd Reconnaissance Battalion. They'd never served in the same province, never known each other over there. But they'd both come home to the same country that wasn't sure what to do with them, and they'd both found the road was the place where they could breathe. Cord had sponsored Reuben's membership in the Iron Meridian. He'd vouched for him before the chapter and ridden beside him through the 14 months of prospecting, which included a winter run through the Colorado Rockies and a sleet storm that had nearly put them both in the ditch on Highway 550. After that storm, sitting in a diner in Durango, Colorado, eating eggs at 2 in the morning with their wet gloves draped over the back of a heater, Cord had looked at him across the table and said simply, "You and me, brother." No elaboration. No ceremony. Just that. And it had been enough. When Reuben was voted out of the Iron Meridian in 2003, Cord had called him once. Reuben had let it go to voicemail. Cord left a message, 4 sentences long, his voice rough and careful, saying he believed Reuben and was fighting the decision from inside the chapter. Reuben had not called back. He'd told himself there was nothing to say. The truth was, he couldn't stand the sound of someone believing in him from the wrong side of a door he'd been shut out of. So he hadn't called back, and then a month passed, and then a year, and then the gap between them filled up with silence the way silence always fills when you give it room. 11 years. He lay in that tent outside Santa Rosa and listened to the wind and thought, there's not much time left. What did that mean? He turned it over. He decided not to guess. He had 1,700 miles left to ride. The next morning was gray and cold and beautiful, the sky a flat pewter sheet that diffused the light evenly across the mesa. He packed the bedroll before 6, kicked the Triumph on the first attempt. The cold had thickened the oil and the kick was stiff, but the engine caught with a gratifying snarl, and rolled east on I-40 into the lightning morning, his breath misting in the slipstream. He crossed into Texas at Glenrio, a ghost town right on the state line. Nothing there but old foundations and a rusted gas pump and a highway sign, and for a long moment he slowed to look at it all. Places that had been full of life and then emptied out. He'd been thinking about that kind of thing since leaving Flagstaff. He bypassed Amarillo without stopping, pushing southeast toward Oklahoma City on I-40. The Texas Panhandle was flat in every direction, the wind brutal and relentless from the northwest. He tucked behind the fairing. The Triumph had no fairing, so he tucked behind nothing at all, making himself small on the seat, chin to the tank, watching the lane lines disappear under his wheel one after another in the long rhythm of exposure. By Shamrock, Texas, his left hand had gone numb. He stopped at a diner on Route 66 where a waitress named Jean filled his coffee cup twice without him asking and kept the pot near his table through the whole meal. eggs, sausage, wheat toast. The local news on a wall-mounted television, the volume low, a rancher in a Stetson at the counter eating pie. The heater in the corner of the room clicked and wheezed and produced a dry warmth that smelled of dust and scorched metal. Reuben ate slowly and felt the sensation return to his fingers and noticed how the small, plain comfort of a warm room and eggs on a plate could hollow out the chest with gratitude. He rode east through Oklahoma City on I-40 that afternoon, the skyline of modest towers reflecting the November light, and then turned north on I-35 for a short stretch before cutting east again on US 270 toward McAllister, the highway narrowing and the countryside changing, rolling red hills, short grass, stands of blackjack oak beginning to appear. The west was behind him now. He could feel it. He stopped for gas in McAllister as the light was failing. He'd been on the road since before 6. He'd ridden close to 400 miles since Santa Rosa. The Triumph ran with a slight hesitation at part throttle that he'd been meaning to tune out of the carburetors, probably a lean spot in the needle jet circuit, and he'd been feeling every one of the last 100 miles in his lower back. He found a motel on US 270 for $45 a night, pushed the Triumph under the covered walkway outside his door, and sat on the edge of the motel bed in his jacket and jeans and thought about the note again. There's not much time left. He pulled the photograph out and looked at it. 2 men on motorcycles, Route 89 in Page, Arizona. He tried to place the year. Cord was riding the Shovelhead, so before 1994, when it finally threw a rod and Cord reluctantly replaced it with a 1992 Harley-Davidson FXRS Lowrider. Reuben was on his old 81 Kawasaki KZ1000, before he moved to the Honda. Maybe 1992. Maybe 91. He'd been 40-something. He'd had his whole biker life in front of him, whole years of road still to ride, the Iron Meridian still a future possibility rather than a past wound. He set the photograph on the bedside table and looked at the 2 men in it for a long time. The man on the left, himself, had his arm around Cord's shoulder and was squinting into the sun with an expression that wasn't quite a smile but was adjacent to one. Content, maybe. At ease in a way that required witnessing to understand. He'd forgotten he could look like that. He fell asleep with the light on. The third day took him through Arkansas on I-40 east toward Little Rock, and then northeast on I-30, then I-40 again, and the landscape shifted in the slow, unmistakable way of the Mid-South, the soil darkening from red to brown to black, the trees thickening, oaks and hickories replacing the sparse scrub. Farmhouses with wide porches. Grain elevators beside railroad tracks. The air held more moisture here, not yet cold enough to freeze it out. He could smell the difference, a living dampness, something organic and green beneath the November mud. The sky hung lower than in Arizona, as if the continent were contracting above him. Outside Conway, Arkansas, a highway patrol cruiser pulled alongside him and kept pace for about a mile, the officer inside giving the Triumph a long professional look. Reuben held his speed and his lane without variation. The cruiser accelerated past. He exhaled. He stopped for gas and lunch in Memphis, Tennessee, crossing the Mississippi River on the Hernando de Soto Bridge, the Triumph's engine note bouncing off the steel trusses above, the river below the color of old pewter, wide and indifferent and tremendous. He pulled off on the Tennessee side and sat on a guardrail and looked at the river for a while. The Mississippi is one of the few things in America that is actually as large as advertised. He felt small beside it in the way that is healthy. He ate a pulled pork sandwich at a counter inside a gas station that also sold live bait and lottery tickets, and the woman who made the sandwich did it with the focused care of someone who regards the task as worth doing correctly. It was a very good sandwich. He left a $5 tip on a $4 purchase and she looked at him with an expression that suggested she'd had worse days. Nashville came and went in the late afternoon. He took I-24 east out of Nashville, cutting through the edge of the Cumberland Plateau, and the road began to rise and curve in the particular way of mountain country. Rock cuts appeared on either side of the highway, layered straight of limestone and shale exposed by the blade, the Earth's autobiography, written in stone, patient and silent. The air dropped 5 degrees. He pulled over on a breakdown lane and dug his scarf from the canvas tool bag and wrapped it around his throat. He was getting close. He knew this part of the world, knew it by reputation, knew it from Cord's stories. Eastern Kentucky is a place that holds things. Old grudges and old loyalties and old ways of understanding obligation. The mountains don't let things escape easily. The hollows fill with weather that sits and settles. The people who grew up there carry it in their posture, a compressed toughness that has nothing to do with aggression and everything to do with endurance. He crossed into Kentucky on I-24 south of Clarksville and then picked up US 119 south, which was the road that took him into the mountains proper. The highway tightened here, following creek beds between ridgelines, the trees close on both sides, the light going fast. He passed through Pineville without stopping and continued southeast, the Triumph's headlight throwing a yellow cone into the gathering dark, the engine working harder on the grades, the exhaust note changing register against the hillsides. He rolled into Harlan, Kentucky at 8:43 in the evening of the fourth day on the road. 1,956 miles. He'd checked the odometer against his starting figure and the numbers lined up almost exactly. There was something in that, though he couldn't have said precisely what. Harlan was a small city of just over 2,000 people in the Cumberland Mountains, built around the confluence of Martin's Fork and Clover Fork of the Cumberland River. Coal country. The streets downtown had the particular character of places where an industry once thrived and then receded, storefronts with different businesses every few years, a few empty lots where buildings had come down, churches on nearly every corner with full parking lots on Wednesday evenings, the local economy held together by the faith of its people more than any enterprise. He liked it immediately. There was dignity in it, not the dignity of prosperity but the deeper kind, the kind that remains when prosperity leaves. He found the address from Cord's note, 114, Cumberland Street, and turned off US 421 onto a residential block where the houses were set close to the road and the porches held rocking chairs and woodpiles and the occasional hound dog raised its head to watch him pass. He cut the engine in front of a white clapboard house with a rusted tin roof and a single lamp burning in the front window. He sat on the Triumph for a moment, engine off, listening to the cooling tick of it. Then the front door opened and a woman came out onto the porch. She was perhaps 60, with gray-streaked dark hair pulled back, wearing a housecoat over a flannel shirt, her arms crossed against the cold. She looked at him for a moment. "You're Reuben." She said it flat, not a question. "Yes, ma'am." "He's been waiting." She held the door open. "Leave the bike. Nobody's going to touch it." Her name was Patsy Pruett, Cord's sister. She'd moved back to Harlan from Cincinnati 8 months ago when the diagnosis came. She'd sold her apartment, her car, her accounting practice of 22 years, and moved back to the house where she and Cord had grown up, because that was the kind of thing you did for your brother. She told him all of this in the kitchen while she heated soup on the stove and Reuben sat at the table with his jacket off, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee she'd put in front of him without asking if he wanted it. He did want it. "What's the diagnosis?" He kept his voice even. Patsy's shoulders moved in a way that was more reflex than answer. "Pancreatic." She adjusted the flame under the soup. "Stage 4. They caught it in August." The soup was vegetable, from a big pot she'd clearly made earlier in the day, and it smelled of thyme and bay leaf and slow cooking. She ladled it into a bowl and set it before him and he ate it without saying anything because there was nothing adequate to say. She sat across the table and watched him eat. "He's awake," she said after a while. "He waits up late. Always has." "Is he?" Reuben stopped. Started again. "Is he in pain?" "Some days are harder." She picked up her own mug. "Today was a good day." "He knew you were coming." "I didn't tell him I was coming." She looked at him over the rim of her mug. "He knew anyway." He found Cord in the back bedroom. The room had a hospital bed, the kind with adjustable rails and a motorized head section, and beside it a standard bedside table covered in a precise arrangement of objects, a glass of water, a bottle of prescription pills, a small lamp with an amber shade, and a paperback novel face down and spine cracked, which told you something about the person reading it. The walls held framed photographs, mountains, motorcycles, people at various ages. On the far wall, a window with curtains that let in the blue dark of the night sky. Cord Pruett lay in the bed with his upper body raised, his enormous hands folded on his stomach over a flannel blanket. He was thinner than the photograph. Much thinner. His face had the particular angularity that comes when a body stops having fat to spare, the bones visible beneath the skin. His hair was fully gray, cut short, and his eyes, dark brown, same as always, were as alert as Reuben had ever seen them, steady and precise in a face that had been rearranged by illness around those eyes' constancy. He looked at Reuben in the doorway. A long moment. "You rode." His voice was rougher, lower than memory had it. "What did you ride?" "The Triumph. The '68 Bonneville." Cord's expression shifted, something that moved from pain to interest and then to something adjacent to joy, all in the span of 2 seconds. "You finished it." "Finished it last week." Reuben came in and sat in the chair beside the bed. It was a wooden kitchen chair, clearly placed there for the purpose of visitors. "First mile she's ever run." Cord turned his head to look at the window. "How'd she ride?" 40 miles per hour, Reuben said. "She wants to run the earth. 60, she settles in and just goes. At 70 she starts suggesting you reconsider your choices." Cord made a sound that was the ghost of a laugh. His chest moved with it carefully. 1900 miles, Reuben said. 56. 56. On a 60-year-old motorcycle. 67 years old. And I packed aspirin. Cord unfolded his hands and held one out and Reuben took it. The grip was still strong, not the power grip of before, but the grip of a man who decides to mean it. They held on for a moment and neither of them said anything, and the quiet in the room was of the kind that has weight and temperature, like water. Then Cord said, "I need you to hear something." "I know. I need you to hear all of it. Even the part that's hard." Reuben sat back in the chair. "I've got nowhere to be." What Cord told him across the next hour and a half was this: Dillard Hennessy had been placed in the Iron Meridian chapter by a man named Vernon Clute, who was a county-level informant for the Coconino Sheriff's Department, who had himself been pressured by the DEA after a drug arrest in 2001 into producing evidence of criminal activity within motorcycle clubs in northern Arizona. Clute had cited Hennessy as a provocateur. Hennessy had fabricated the document, the supposed statement bearing Reuben's name, using a notary stamp stolen from a real estate office in Williams, Arizona, and a county form he'd accessed through a contact in the clerk's office. Cord had suspected this within weeks of Reuben's expulsion. He'd spent the next 2 years quietly building the evidence. He'd interviewed the real estate office where the stamp was stolen. He'd found the clerk's office contact, who, under enough patient pressure, admitted what he'd done. He'd found Hennessy's connection to Clute. He'd constructed the whole chain, link by link, riding alone to places he'd never intended to go, knocking on doors he had no business knocking on, because he had made a promise, silent and unspoken, but a promise nonetheless, to the man who'd ridden with him through a Colorado sleet storm at 2 in the morning and hadn't flinched. He'd brought the evidence to Walt Tibbetts in 2005. Walt had reviewed it. And then Walt had done nothing. Reuben looked at him. "Nothing. He admitted to me privately that he believed it. Said the chapter couldn't revisit it without opening up a process that would expose the club to legal scrutiny." Cord's jaw tightened. He chose the institution over the man. There was a long silence. "The club disbanded anyway," Cord said. "Flagstaff chapter folded in 2009. Most of them scattered. Walt moved to Idaho. Hennessy disappeared sometime in '07, no one knows where." He paused. "The thing that was done to you, the wrong, it just sat there. Unaddressed. For 11 years. Reuben's hands were on his knees. He looked at them. "I called you," Cord said. "After it happened." "You didn't." "I know." Reuben looked up. "I know I didn't call back. I wasn't asking for an explanation. I know that too." The amber lamp hummed quietly between them. Somewhere in the house, Patsy was moving around the kitchen, the sound of a cabinet closing, water running briefly. The comfortable sounds of someone maintaining things. "I want to do something before I can't," Cord said. His voice was careful, deliberate, the way you speak when you know each word has a specific purpose. "There are 4 men from the old Flagstaff chapter who are still reachable. Men who voted on you and didn't know the truth because I hadn't built the case yet when they voted. Amos Kerr, in Prescott. Lyle Fader, in Kingman. Pete Solano, in Albuquerque. And a man named Dale Briggs, who retired to Holbrook." He paused to breathe. "I've been in contact with all 4. I've sent them the evidence. Every page of it. They've read it." Reuben looked at him steadily. "They want to talk to you. Directly." Cord unfolded a piece of paper from the drawer of the bedside table and held it out. "Phone numbers. All 4. They're waiting." Reuben didn't take the paper immediately. He sat with his hands still on his knees and looked at his friend's face, the thinned down face, the gray hair, the steady dark eyes, and thought about 11 years. He thought about the patch arriving folded in an envelope. He thought about the voicemail he hadn't returned. He thought about the Triumph sitting in the garage for 3 years, waiting for a reason to move. He thought about the photograph, 2 men on motorcycles on Route 89, arms around each other's shoulders, squinting into the Arizona sun. He reached out and took the paper. "One more thing," Cord said. He opened the bedside drawer again and removed something, a bundle of cloth, neatly folded, tied with a piece of leather cord. He set it on the blanket between them. "I kept it. After Walt returned it to the chapter just had it sitting in a storage box at the meeting house. When the chapter folded in '09, I took it. I told myself I was keeping it until there was a reason to give it back." He nodded at the bundle. "I'd say there's a reason now." Reuben put his hand on the bundle. He didn't untie the leather cord. He sat with his hand resting on the cloth and felt the thickness of it and the weight of what it represented, not just the physical object, but the 17 years before it was taken away, the rides in all weather, the brothers and the road and the slow-built life of a man who had found his people and then lost them. "Cord." His voice was steady. "Barely. Don't." Cord's voice was quiet. "Don't apologize for not calling back. I know why you didn't. I was going to say thank you." Cord looked at him. Then he looked at the window, at the dark, at the mountains surrounding them that you couldn't see in the night but that you knew were there. "You rode 1,956 miles on a 67-year-old motorcycle," Cord said. The thank you went in the direction of Flagstaff. The next morning Reuben called Amos Kerr from the kitchen table while Patsy made breakfast. The call lasted 22 minutes. Amos Kerr was 61 years old, retired from the fire department in Prescott, living with his wife in a house on Willow Creek Road. His voice on the phone was the voice of a man carrying something he'd wanted to put down for a long time. He told Reuben he'd been suspicious of Hennessy from the beginning. He told him he'd argued against the expulsion and been outvoted 4-2. He told him he'd thought about Reuben Voss specifically on a Tuesday morning in October 2009, when he was riding his 2002 Harley-Davidson Road King West on US 89 toward Prescott, and the thought arrived without warning, the way thoughts do when the road is empty and the mind finally goes quiet, that what had been done to Reuben Voss was wrong, and that he'd participated in it even through his dissenting vote, because dissent without action is just conscience without consequence. He asked Reuben to forgive him. Specific and direct, no hedging. Reuben held the phone and looked out the window at the backyard of the house on Cumberland Street, where a rusted swing set stood in the frosted grass, and he told Amos Kerr that he did. He called Lyle Fader in Kingman next. That call was harder. Lyle had been one of the men who wouldn't meet his eyes the night of the accusation, and Lyle admitted it now, said he'd known, in the part of himself he trusted, that Reuben wasn't the type. But Dillard Hennessy had been convincing and the document had looked official, and Lyle had let himself be carried along by the room's momentum rather than the voice inside him that said to slow down and look harder. He cried during the call, which surprised both of them. Reuben let him, and then said what was true, that he understood how it happened, and that he didn't carry resentment toward the men who'd been deceived. He reserved his feelings about Hennessy for a category he'd decided not to spend any more time in. Pete Solano in Albuquerque was brief and formal and genuine. 3 minutes. He'd been a prospect when it happened, had no vote, but had witnessed the whole proceeding and had never stopped wondering if what he'd seen was right. He said, "I'm glad Cord found a way to do this." Reuben said, "So am I." Dale Briggs in Holbrook was the last call. The longest. Dale had been the chapter's road captain for 6 years, a Vietnam vet like Reuben, Navy, Mekong Delta, swift boat operator, with a face that looked like topographic map of a hard life and a laugh that arrived without warning and meant everything. Dale had voted for the expulsion, he admitted, because Walt Tibbets had pulled him aside before the meeting and told him the evidence was solid and that a dissenting vote would look like disloyalty to the club at a time when the club was under outside scrutiny. He'd taken Walt at his word. He'd been wrong too. He'd known he'd been wrong too within 6 months. He told Reuben he'd been writing a candle for 11 years. A candle? Reuben's voice. Writing with a light on for a dead man, Dale said. Except you weren't dead. You were just gone. They talked for 40 minutes. Dale's wife, whose name was Rosalind, brought them both coffee on their respective ends of the call, she in Holbrook, Patsy in Harlan, without being asked. At the end, Dale said, "If there's ever a way to put something back together. Even informally. Even just the few of us. I want to be part of that." Reuben said he'd keep it in mind. He meant it. He spent 3 days in Harlan. The second day was a Thursday and the November sun came out unexpectedly, thin and gold, and Cord was having one of his good days, so they sat on the back porch wrapped in blankets while Patsy brought out coffee and then retreated tactfully inside to leave them alone. Reuben told Cord about the Triumph rebuild, all 3 years of it, every seized bolt and ruined thread, every evening spent with a parts manual and a set of feeler gauges and the radio playing in the corner of the garage. Cord asked specific, knowledgeable questions. He'd always been the better mechanic of the two. He got the particular brightness in his eyes that Reuben recognized from 30 years of riding beside him, the brightness that appeared whenever the conversation turned to engines and roads and the specific problems of keeping old steel alive. The mountains surrounded them. Reuben could see them now in the daylight, the Cumberland ridgelines, dark with bare hardwood, the sky above them pale and wide. He understood for the first time why Cord had come back here,